welcome back to my garden. Last week's video provoked quite an interesting comment, and round about the time that I was reading it, a story from my dubious past popped into my mind, and some other two sort of came together, so I thought, let's share that with you this week. Let me set the scene. I'd just arrived in England. I was in my early 20s, and my ill-gotten supply of rands had run out far too quickly. Well, they would, wouldn't they, given the exchange rate? And I found myself looking for a job, and I really didn't know how to go about that in a foreign country, or in fact in any country. Not something I'd actually done before. And I sort of stumbled into one. Quite literally, I was walking around near where I lived, and there was a pub, and I stumbled into that, and it turned out they were looking for a barman. So pretty soon I was qualified to pull pints in a Charrington's pub, the Royal Standard in Collier's Wood. Now, Collier's Wood is not one of the most salubrious parts of London, sort of at the southern end of the Northern Line, and not very pretty. And the pub was full of the most extraordinary characters. They wouldn't be out of place in a Guy Ritchie movie. Larger than life, and frankly, they could be a little disturbing. And one of the perfect examples of these was a chap who went by the name of Psycho Gary. Not the biggest guy in the pub. I mean, he wasn't small, probably close to 6 foot and 90 kilos, but there was some very big lumps, labourers who liked to have an amusing punch-up on the weekend. But he was, if not the biggest, probably the most dangerous, and people showed him due respect. Anyway, one day, there was someone who wasn't showing him any respect. It was his ex-wife. And eventually the red mist descended, and he stormed out of the bar. A few glasses had already been smashed. And he went next door to the kebab shop and, well, threw a table through the plate glass window. Extraordinary. A bit later, he was back in the pub, and Brenda, the landlady, a real Dickensian sort of Cockney lady, Gary, why'd you do that? What was that all about? He said, well, you know, Brenda, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. No, Gary, that doesn't make any sense at all. In what world was throwing a table through a window what you had to do? And it was particularly extraordinary behaviour for two reasons. Extraordinary in and of itself, but Amin, the owner of the kebab shop, was a regular in the pub and quite popular. Everyone liked his kebabs. And he had nothing to do with the incident with Gary's wife. And the second reason, which was perhaps more to the point, Gary was sort of waiting for a Crown Court appearance on a charge of GBH, grievous bodily harm. Apparently one night he'd been stumbling home, and he was relieving himself in an alleyway. Two people called out and sort of told him what he should do with himself. He called back, they came down, and he left them in a bloody heap. So he had that waiting for him, and certainly destroying a local establishment wasn't going to be taken kindly to by the local judge. So, no, it made no sense at all. And that just popped into my head, that little story. There are lots of stories But this one sticks in my mind and sort of ties in with the comment I received in a bizarre, well, a massive leap of logic. If you're a regular viewer of this channel, you'll be aware I'm prone to that. But bear with me, I think it will sort of make sense. And what was the comment, actually? I've been mentioned a few times. Well, someone wrote, I know I'm not quoting, but it was something along the lines of, I work my arse off all day, so why shouldn't I have a little amusement, or amuse myself, or whatever it was? And it's a very reasonable comment, something my father would probably approve of. He was very fond of saying, what's wrong with a little pleasure? Life is hard. We take the joy where we can find it. And it does seem reasonable. And indeed, I replied to the gentleman's comment. I think it was a gentleman. And yes, there's nothing, you're perfectly entitled to a little bit of amusement. Nothing wrong with that at all. Perhaps more to the point at this stage, you're wondering, how on earth does that connect with this gentleman throwing a table through a window of a local kebab shop? It doesn't seem even remotely connected. But when this sort of bubbled up to the surface, it struck me that there was actually a common denominator with Postman's article, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and Psycho Gary's disturbingly aggressive behaviour. And the commonality is that I think they are intrinsically self-destructive. I mean, one self-destructive in a very obvious, bold, technicolor sort of way, and self-destructive in the case of Gary, in the sense that shortly he found himself in jail. So, quite literally, very self-destructive. And not just self-destructive, but destructive in general. He wreaked havoc to all those around him. Although he seemed like quite a nice chap, actually, when he was sitting quietly at the bar, just making small talk. But he was prone to fits of extraordinary anger and aggression. So there we are. But what about amusing ourselves to death? What's wrong with that? What's that got to do with all of this? And why would I make a claim that it is self-destructive? But I think when you think about it, it is. Just in a very, very slow, hard to perceive, no, that's not the word, I'm searching for the word. It just kind of insidiously chips away at you. When we are amusing ourselves to death, diving in, wallowing in the media of our day, whether it was television in the 80s or now, sort of binge-watching series on our tablet or phone, or scrolling in a sort of zombie-like fashion through social media. I think it is killing us slowly. It's destroying, as I mentioned last week, Postman's point. It is destroying our ability to concentrate, but it is destroying our, for want of a better term, our life force, our spirit, our soul. It is literally soul destroying. And we're doing this to ourselves. I mean, obviously, it's something very different to to more extreme self-destructive acts. And I don't want to try and suggest that the two activities are even remotely similar, because, well, they're not comparable. Of course they're not. But I think the long-term effect is something that we need to take seriously. Probably this is a moment to fall back on some sort of metaphor. And indeed, in my reply to a comment, I said, well, of course, there is nothing wrong with amusing ourselves, but the way we choose to amuse ourselves might, well, therein might lie a difference. You know, there's a world of difference between watching, as I said, a romantic comedy with your wife and smoking a crack pipe. You know, these are not the same forms of idle distraction. But if I was to try and think of some sort of comparison, probably a good one would be the crack pipe and a cigarette. Now, the cigarette is, relatively speaking, compared to some sort of brutal drug, quite harmless. But nonetheless, I think we could agree, in the long term, potentially lethal. And certainly, even if it doesn't kill you, it's not doing you any good. It is an act of self-destruction. And it is an act that you sort of are happy to go along with. And indeed, when we speak to smokers, they are often reluctant to stop. They're aware that it's not very good for them, but they rationalize it. Well, you know, it's probably not very good for me, but, well, what's wrong with a little cigarette? And, you know, what would life be if we removed all our simple pleasures? You can see that it starts becoming very, very similar to the type of argument that my father would put forward. What's wrong with a little simple pleasure? Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that binge watching a series on Netflix is going to kill you. Literally, it's not. Not even in a long, slow, imperceptible sort of way. But it is, I think, profoundly damaging. And I think on some sort of psychological level, there's another sort of commonality, that dear old Gary in the pub, when he had situations, frustrations, issues in his life that he found difficult to deal with, he would suppress those feelings as much as he could until it all came, you know, bursting out in a violent act. I mean, sometimes there was a catalyst. He was rather fond on the weekend of 8 pints of strong cider and a few joints. Now, that's not necessarily a good combination in terms of emotional well-being or anger management. Certainly wasn't in his case. And again, you know, I'm sure if you're out there watching this video, you are not as socially maladjusted as so many of the clientele in the Royal Standard back in the day in Collier's Wood. But if I look at my own life, and if I'm being really honest, I think I was, not for a sort of brief period, a few years here or there, when times were tough, but for decades, I think I was, in so many ways, extraordinarily self-destructive. I don't think in a way that necessarily many of my good friends would have felt compelled, well, they didn't, to make an intervention of some sort. But nonetheless, I think, if I'm being honest, many of the things that I was doing really weren't doing me any good. And if truth be told, weren't giving me any real pleasure either. Right, well, that's not a very cheery note to end on, and I've passed the 15-minute mark, so perhaps this is going to be a video that will roll on into a part 2. I'm not sure. Be that as it may, I would love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you think. Otherwise, I trust your lives are filled with joy. I'm not too much in the way of self-destructive behaviour. And until next week, from sunny Brazil, ciao.